You know, in the Bible, we encounter a phenomenon that is unique in the history of the world's religions. We encounter a God who is deeply involved in the world of human history. Many of the events that are chronicled in the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament too for that matter, can be placed into the framework of established historical events. Indeed, the entire corpus of biblical literature is deeply intertwined with the events occurring in Israel and in its neighboring lands. So any good understanding of the Bible requires at least a basic familiarity with the history of the Israelite people. So that'll be our focus for these next few minutes. Now the Bible begins, curiously enough, in the beginning, with the creation of all things. The first 11 chapters of the Bible focus on what we might call the universal story. These familiar episodes involving Adam and Eve and Noah and the Tower of Babel aren't so much history in the way we typically think of history, but they do establish the theological foundations of the biblical history by portraying God as a person who's deeply involved in human affairs, and somebody who has universal sovereignty over all the peoples of the world. Now, the real historical narrative of the Bible begins in Genesis chapter 12, where God calls a man named Abram, who later is known as Abraham, to become the father of a new nation. God made 3 specific promises to Abraham. Promise number 1, he would have many descendants. Promise number 2, they'd receive a homeland. And promise number 3, through Abraham all the nations of the world would be blessed. Abraham eventually had a son named Isaac, and he had a boy named Jacob. Jacob's name was later changed to Israel. He became the father of 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. The Israelites, as they were called, eventually migrated into Egypt, and there they became enslaved for 400 years. Now, sometime around maybe 1450 or 1275 BC, God called a man named Moses to deliver the Israelites out of slavery. Moses had been raised in the palace of Pharaoh, and so he was well aware of the power and might of Egypt, but he was also a Hebrew, and so he had a heart for his people, and God used him to bring deliverance. He brought plagues upon the land of Egypt, and eventually Pharaoh was persuaded that it was more trouble to have the Israelites around than it was to let them go. And so the people were sent forth from the land of Egypt. They made their way toward the land that God had promised to Abraham, pausing on the way at Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments and God's other laws. When Moses eventually died, he was succeeded by a fellow named Joshua, who led them in the conquest of the land that had been promised to Abraham, taking it away from its current inhabitants, the Canaanites. Israel then began the task of settling into their new country. For several centuries, Israel formed a loose tribal confederacy, leadership being sporadically provided by charismatic figures called the judges. These were people who were called by God in times of crisis to deliver Israel from its enemies and to establish some justice in the land, and maybe even return the people back to the Lord when they had gone off and started worshiping the pagan gods of their neighbors. Eventually, however, the Israelites decided that they wanted a king like other nations around them. So around 1050 BC or so, a man named Saul became Israel's first king. But because he was disobedient to God, and perhaps because God wished to make him an object lesson, Saul was eventually replaced by David. David became the touchstone for Israel's kings, sort of like King Arthur for the Britons. He was a very human man and made his mistakes, but in spite of his flaws, the Bible tells us that God had a special love for David, and God promised him that his dynasty would never be destroyed. After David's death, his son Solomon took over. Now, Solomon's reign was relatively peaceful and marked by a period of architectural expansion and growth. His greatest achievement was the temple he built in Jerusalem, a wonder of the ancient world. But because Solomon began to worship pagan gods, the Lord judged Israel. After Solomon had died in about 922 BC, civil war broke out in Israel, and the kingdom split in two. Most of the tribes formed the northern kingdom of Israel. Some, however, formed the southern kingdom of Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem. The northern kingdom of Israel was a larger and more prosperous of the two, but according to the Bible, its kings were a pretty bad bunch, leading their nation into idolatry and other wicked behaviors. They included people like Jeroboam I, who set up calf idols in his temples, and like Ahab, who married the pagan priestess Jezebel. The best efforts of prophets like Elijah and Hosea and Amos couldn't turn the people away from their wicked behavior. And so, in 722 or 21 BC, God decided that it was time to judge Israel because of its evil. God brought the Assyrians down from Mesopotamia. This violent, ruthless people conquered an empire that stretched all the way from Babylon on down into Egypt, and included, of course, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Well, Israel rebelled against the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrians responded with great speed and with severity. The people of Israel were carried off as captives, taken into exile. The land was repopulated with foreigners, but the kingdom of Israel was no more. The situation with the southern kingdom, Judah, was a little different. Its kings were a mixed bag. There were some good kings down there like Jehoshaphat and Hezekiah, and also some bad kings like Ahaziah and Jehoahaz. The Bible uses one main criterion to evaluate the reigns of these kings. Good kings are kings that lead the people to be faithful to the Lord. Bad kings promote idolatry. One king, a fellow named Manasseh, was so wicked that God pledged to judge Judah with exile, just as he had done to the kingdom of Israel. It took several decades and several steps for that prophecy to be fulfilled. First, in 609 BC, King Josiah, the good king of Judah, was killed in battle against the Egyptians. The Egyptians placed Jehoiakim upon the throne. The king of Judah was forced to swear allegiance to his new Egyptian overlord. But that was only the beginning. Just a few years later, in 605 BC, the Egyptians were driven back into their own land by the Babylonians, and the people of Judah found themselves with new foreign overlords. Now they were under the heel of Nebuchadnezzar the Great, king of Babylon. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar was not a cruel overlord, as tyrants go, but even so, the people of Judah chafed under his domination. In 597 BC, they revolted against the king of Babylon. The king of Judah was expecting reinforcements from Egypt, but they never materialized, and Babylon quickly quelled the revolt. King Jehoiakim was killed, and his son and many other leading citizens of Judah were taken up as hostages to Babylon to discourage any further revolts. But Judah had not learned its lesson. In 588 or 87 BC, Jehoiakim's replacement, King Zedekiah, once again rebelled against the Babylonians. This time, King Nebuchadnezzar was not inclined to be merciful. His armies marched forth and lay siege to Jerusalem, and soon the great gates gave way. The temple of Solomon and the palace and the city walls were destroyed, and many of the people were taken away as captives to Babylon in what has become known as the Babylonian Exile. It was one of the saddest and yet most creative periods in Judah's history. So the northern kingdom, Israel, is no more. Its people are scattered. The southern kingdom, Judah, is a captive nation. Many of its people are living far away in the land of Babylon. Is that the end of the story of the people of God, the children of Abraham? Not yet. In 539 BC, the Persians conquered the Babylonian Empire and added it to their own kingdom. Their great king, Cyrus the Great, issued a decree allowing all the captives of Babylon to return home. The Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their city and rebuild their temple. In 515 BC, that great feat was accomplished. A new temple was built, and the Second Temple period had begun. And yet the land of Judah was not like it was in the old days. First of all, it was much smaller. There were far fewer people living there than there had been in the days of the empires of the kings. Second of all, they no longer had kings. They were now administered by governors, people like Ezra and Nehemiah. Also, surrounded by the pagans on every side and with pagan overlords, the threat of persecution loomed large over their heads all the time. But even so, it was a prosperous time for the Jews as they continued to spread out throughout the kingdom. Humbled and strengthened by adversity, they seemed more committed to the exclusive worship of the Lord than at any time in their history. The Jewish spirit remained strong, and hope continued to burn in their hearts. Their prophets had promised that one day God would restore their nation and reestablish the dynasty of King David. They had no certainty about how or when that would occur, but many of the Jews continued to trust that the final chapter of their national epic had still not yet been written.